The first thing to look at in biblical literature is a little update. So you want to get as much of this as you can in your notes and then transfer it to an earlier place in your notes where it's applicable. I came across this article, it's been a couple of weeks ago, and then it was brought to my attention last week by someone here in the church who had been to Professor Beale's study in Rutland, where I don't remember exactly how or where, but this article and this topic was brought up. And it was a fascinating article that I had read hurriedly and had marked up. I've got it dated October the 3rd, 1986, and then had filed away. And I knew, well, I didn't file it away because I knew I wanted to get it back out eventually, and so I appreciate someone bringing it to my attention so I could bring it back out and give you a little update. What this concerns are the old Syriac Gospels. Remember when we discussed that, the old Syriac Gospels. So I want to bring you up to date concerning the Sinaitic Syriac, which was, well, I can just give you, it was abbreviated SYR and then the superscript, little superscript S. I just want to go over this briefly and then we'll get into what we want to study this morning. Old Syriac Gospels, remember, were, according to our studies and according from all of the available evidence now, were the earliest, served as the earliest translations for the Greek New Testament. Syriac was the earliest language into which the Greek was translated. Evidently, the Gospels were the first of the books to be translated, and the real evidence that we have for that were two manuscripts, both discovered last century. One that we refer to as the Curtonian Syriac manuscript, and the other as the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript. Now, don't confuse Sinaiticus with Sinaitic. Sinaiticus is the Greek manuscript, remember, discovered by Tischendorf, discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, which happens to be the self-same location where Sinaitic Syriac, they go by the same name because they were both discovered on Mount Sinai at St. Catherine's Monastery, and both last century, Tischendorf first and these two Scottish twin sisters after that. But Sinaitic Syriac is in the Syriac language. And that may well be, according to this article, and I even said it whenever we had taught on this a few months ago, that may well be the earliest extant manuscript that we have of a translation of the New Testament. That is, although the manuscript doesn't come like the beginning of the 2nd century or something, it's really probably a 4th century manuscript. It dates back to a text that had to have begun somewhere 100 to 150, 125 to 150 AD, somewhere around there, wherein these Syriac Gospels were first translated from Greek into Syriac. The little history about that, which is already on an earlier tape, it was discovered in 1892 by two Scottish twin sisters, Mrs. Agnes S. Lewis and Margaret D. Gibson. You've got this on an earlier tape, probably entitled Evidence for the Old Syriac Gospels. And they discovered it when they were poking around St. Catherine's Monastery one day. It's a palimpsest. It had been erased in the end of the 8th century at a convent near Antioch. It had been erased and written over with a non-canonical work, which was entitled The Lives of the Female Saints, by some unknown scribe. The Lives of the Female Saints. So that means that the old writing has been erased or scraped off. And by the way, it's written on parchment and not papyrus, so it's really not been erased, it's been scraped off. But still, with the impressions of the stylus in the material, a stylus maybe with ink on it, with impressions of that, or some type of writing instrument with ink on it, you left marks, you left tiny, tiny, tiny grooves in the leather, in the parchment, in the sheepskin as you were writing. So even though you can kind of scrape that off, unless you just scrape it down to the depth to which the letter itself was carved into the parchment, you're going to have some resemblance of that later on. Of course, over the years, that's going to wear and wear and wear, and it's going to wear its way down towards the depth to which the letter itself had been carved or written into the piece of parchment, but probably something of it would still be left. So the way they'd treat that is with chemicals and photography. And it was treated with both of those in the 1890s, and then again in the 1920s. And some of the material they were able to read. but a lot of it has really remained a mystery. And so just this year, it's been going on 10 years, but they're finally getting some results now. And I'll leave this article here this week, and I'll pick it up next weekend if you want to stop by and look at it. It's a fascinating article. I'm going to summarize it for you this morning. It came out of Christianity Today, entitled Recovering the Erased Gospels. Scholars are using high-tech methods to study the earliest translation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Probably Sinaitic Syriac is the earliest translation of the four Gospels. Okay, the man that it concerns is one James Charlesworth. He happens to be very familiar to us because he's the one who edited those two big thick volumes on the pseudepigrapha, and I brought those big thick volumes. You got a part 1 and a part 2, and the second volume just came out like this year or last year. James Charlesworth. All right, he began this adventure of his in 1976, watching TV one day. It said that this idea came to him. By the way, he was a Princeton theological seminary professor. He's a scholar in Greek, a scholar in Syriac, a scholar in Aramaic, quite a scholar in several different things. And the thought came to him, how could he use space-age techniques to read this ancient manuscript that, we have known, it's been around now for about 100 years. And let's see where to pick up here. I've already given you the background of the manuscript itself, which is the first page of what they're talking about here. Here's a little bit about the discovery of the manuscript and then how Charlesworth is working himself, or has worked himself, into this monastery, St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai. It says the Sinaitic Syriac is part of the venerable collection of over 3,000 ancient manuscripts housed in the fortress-like monastery of St. Catherine at the base of Mount Sinai's steep slopes. Western scholars have long known that manuscript treasures, including the Sinaitic Syriac, were housed in this 6th century monastery built by the Emperor Justinian. But although the treasures of St. Catherine's have been known, or at least suspected, the monks often would not allow Western scholars to examine them. The monks had good reason to be suspicious of Western visitors. See if this story doesn't sound familiar. In 1844, the ambitious German scholar Constantine Tischendorf returned from St. Catherine's with 43 leaves of parchment obtained under false pretenses. And in 1859, he, quote, borrowed, unquote, the trusting monk's most precious manuscript, Codex Sinaiticus, which is the Greek copy of the New Testament, which contains the only existing complete Greek New Testament in an uncial, an early rounded capital script, along with parts of the Old Testament and some early Christian books. Tischendorf promised to return the codex within a month and a half. After 2 months of copying the manuscript, Tischendorf suggested to the monks that he take it to Russia and offer it to Tsar Alexander II as a gift of appreciation. He had kind of sponsored the monastery there. But they would not agree. However, reluctantly, they allowed him to take it on loan to Russia in order to make a photographic facsimile of it. That was the last they ever saw of their beloved codex. For in a desperate effort to raise money in the 1930s, I think it was 1933, Christmas Day, the Soviet government sold the codex to the British Museum, which it really was not theirs. They did not own it. It still belonged to St. Catherine Monastery. The monks still have Tischendorf's letter promising the return of Codex Sinaiticus, framed and hanging on St. Catherine's library wall. So they've been suspicious of any Western scholars ever since then. The monastic community has a long memory. That's over 100 years ago. So it took several visits by Professor Charlesworth before he finally gained the monks' trust. Unlike visitors of early centuries who scorned the monastery's culture and liturgy, Charlesworth entered into the life of the community, worshiping with them every morning from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. He had to do this to gain their trust. Once Professor Charlesworth gained the monks' confidence, he knew he would need top-flight technical help to ensure the best possible results. You can see him on the front page here. He's holding it up. The caption, Charlesworth at Mount Sinai, quote from him, "I could see by holding the leaves up to the sunlight just how delicate they are. You also can see through it, and you can see the print that's been scraped off. The slightest jarring would have turned them into fragments like confetti. That's how delicate this is." Remember, it's a millennium and a half old, though. So he needs to find someone. What do we read here? He needs top-flight technical help. Bruce Zuckerman, director of the West Semitic Research Project at the University of Southern California, USC, was recruited to do the photography. He's considered by experts to be the best manuscript photographer in the world. Zuckerman is more than a technically expert photographer. He holds a PhD from Yale in Near Eastern languages and is an expert epigrapher, which is a specialist in reading ancient inscriptions. Then he got his brother Ken, who was a technician and photographic expert, whose achievements included photographing individual particles of moon dust while he was a graduate student at Caltech. So anyway, they get there. He didn't even know whether they were going to have running water, electricity, or anything. So they carry water, they carry their own generator, they carry everything because, oh yeah, one thing, let's see, Charles Worth had to succeed the first time he went. His agreement with the monks stipulated that after his team photographed the codex, it would be locked away in the monastery, inaccessible to scholars forever after that. So this was the last time any other person besides one of those monks would ever see this manuscript. So Charles Worth knew he had like a couple of days that he was going to spend there, and he had to do a perfect job because no Western scholar would ever see that again as long as it existed. Which is just, it's terrible that the monks and monasteries think that way about some of these priceless treasures of theirs. We need to study and study and study that, but he got one shot at it and that's all, and that's over with now and no one will ever see that manuscript again. So let's see. They found out that the monastery did have its own generator. I mean, you're way out in the desert, so you don't have electric lines running from Jerusalem down there to you or something, you know. You got to power your own electricity there. It says it drained their batteries so rapidly they had to use every outlet in the monastery during the 3 hours each day that the generators were operated. They just turned the generators on 3 hours per day at the monastery there to light things up or cook or do whatever, and then turned everything off. The entire process was tremendously wearing. All told, each of the pages containing the Gospels was photographed 13 times. Each cycle of 13 exposures took 20 minutes, and each workday lasted from 8 to 11 hours. Here's a picture of Bruce Zuckerman, and here's some of the photographic work that's being done, you know, with all types of chemicals and all types of photographic equipment. But, you know, they're professional experts at these procedures to try to get it the best possible now. It's only shots you're going to get. They did it in black and white, color, every angle imaginable, so that when you put it all together, and it's all fed into the computer. All these photographs are fed into the computer, and it's supposed to be able to read everything and make the best guess if something's missing on the basis of the thousands of other letters here in this text, what letter was supposed to be right here. See, that never could have been done without the advent of the computers today and what they can do. Then, like any article such as this will have to do, you can't just give people the technical or you'll bore them, the meaning of it all. So we have to end on a little interesting note. And evidently, Beale was probably reading the article quickly because what I had told you last week was correct and Beale was incorrect, but he probably made a mistake reading it too quickly. And that concerns the ending of Mark's Gospel. One of the first places Charles Worth looked in the new photographs of the Sinaitic Syriac was at the end of Mark's Gospel. That's what he was interested in, obviously. Previous work with this manuscript had made it clear that Mark ended with Mark 16:8, omitting like many other ancient manuscripts those last verses, 9 to 20. Charles Worth wanted to see if 16:8 fell at the bottom of a page, suggesting perhaps that the missing traditional verses were on a missing leaf of the codex. That could well be if it fell at the bottom of a page. We just lost that last leaf that had just a few verses on it. He also wanted to see if the ancient scribe had left a space between the end of Mark and the beginning of Luke, perhaps suggesting at the very least that the scribe knew of the existence of that longer ending but simply didn't include it himself. Finally, the photograph was before my eyes, Charles Worth recounts, and I read the ending of Mark. It's in Syriac, but he can read Syriac. I came down the right column to the bottom. Syriac, Aramaic, Hebrew, they're all read from right to left. So let's give ourselves two columns. He says, I came down the right column to the bottom. went back to the top of the left column, came halfway down, and Mark ended. Here's the bottom of the page down here. Then there were 9 little circles that the scribe had written from right to left. So something, like this. Which is kind of like, an end, a little squiggly to the end of what you're going to write. Then a space, and then the statement, the beginning, a little space here, of the Gospel of Luke. So, in other words, the implications are obvious. He said it was clear that a page had not been lost. That's one thing that's very clear, is a page hasn't been lost because Luke starts here. Another thing that seems very clear is that he was not even aware of any material that should have gone in here. He ended his manuscript with these little circles here, left a space, and remember, a piece of parchment was so precious, you started, even if you only got a couple of words for your next book on the end of this page, you started there anyway, because those were precious pieces of material, writing material there. He starts Luke's Gospel there. Scholars have long known that Mark 16, 9-20 is a later addition to the Gospel. But scholars have also long debated how Mark should end, since somehow verse 8 does not sound like the conclusion to a book, if you read Mark 16:8, especially in its Greek form. The Sinaitic Syriac does not solve the mystery of Mark's ending. It does, however, strengthen a long-standing scholarly judgment that 9-20 is a spurious extra-canonical ending to the Gospel of Mark. So Beale, I think, has said just the reverse, that it was supposed to be there, but probably he had read over it quickly or something. And I remember reading this, and it all stood out to me, that having looked over Sinaitic Syriac, which is the earliest translation of any portion of the New Testament, it evidently was never intended to include the last section of Mark chapter 16. So you can put all that back under Sinaitic Syriac because that's something recent. And as I hear of new developments, even if it's not in biblical literature, even if we're not in that study anymore, I'll have to come back and bring you up to date, and you can go insert it back in your notes then. Okay, we all understand that? It's a very interesting and important manuscript, Sinaitic Syriac. Okay, we want to wrap up the Latin Vulgate this morning. Look at Jerome's Enduring Bible. Now, although the Protestant Reformation did a lot to weaken the prevailing influence of the Vulgate by giving us so many vernacular translations, nothing really could totally put it under. Now, that's been 400 years ago since the Reformation, and of course the Vulgate still has not been put under. I think I've already mentioned how greatly our terminology, even in Protestantism, has been influenced by the Latin of the Vulgate, sometimes in giving us a Latin translation of a Greek term, sometimes in just bringing the Greek term into greater popularity. And so here, as we're concluding this study, I thought I would give you a formal, rather long list, even though I've given you a shorter one before, of some of the important theological terms that have come into Protestant theology, as well as Roman Catholic theology, through the prevailing influence of the Latin Vulgate. So here are some of those words that you might want to jot down. In other words, we use them because of the influence of the Vulgate. Some of these are purely Latin words, just a translation of a Greek term. Some of them are like transliterations of a Greek term, where the Latin use of that Greek term just brought the Greek term into great popularity, so that we more or less use the Greek term today. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. Predestination. That comes from the Vulgate. In other words, if we didn't have that, you could invent any other word, promostration. Well, maybe that means the same thing. We just happen to use this because of how it was used in the Vulgate in those passages that speak of predestination. You see, we call it predestination now. We could have called it by some other term. Justification. And notice we're talking about our heavyweight theological terms. And so here's one way that Jerome's Bible has endured. We're looking at how his Bible has endured. And remember, we're talking about around 400 A.D., and we're almost 2,000 years past that time, a millennium and a half past that time. And if we think that his Bible has been done in and put under, we need to think twice. Every time we use these terms, we're using the Latin Vulgate. Sanctification. These big, huge theological terms. Regeneration. Every time you speak of someone being unregenerate, that old nasty term some of us use, a person's unregenerate, it's not that nasty. It's better, I guess, than saying what Jesus said in John 8:44, your father's the devil. Propitiation. Then we are using a hieronymus term. Reconciliation. It's all the big ones, all the heavyweights got in here. Redemption. And here's one you may not be that familiar with, but it's a big term in theology, satisfaction. There's the so-called satisfaction theory of the atonement. There are all different types of theories for the atonement. What actually did the atonement do? Did it save man, defeat the devil, appease the Father? And so someone emphasized a certain aspect of that and would give it a theory, satisfaction atonement, satisfaction theory. It satisfied God. Election. Inspiration, which is certainly not a Greek term over there in 2 Timothy 3:16. Revelation. You know what the Greek term is there? Apocalypse. Apocalypse is the Greek term for revelation, so it doesn't even look like revelation. We get revelation from Latin. Visitation. Not a big theological term, but, the visitation of God to his people. Edification. Now here's one we Protestants don't use that much, but it still has come into our terminology, at least when we're arguing with Roman Catholics. Supererogation. Supererogation. Super, E-R-O-G-A, supererogation. Here's one we all use, salvation. Greek term for save is sozo. You got an S in there, but how do you get salvation out of that? Congregation. Congregation. Here's another one we Protestants don't use that much, penance, but that came from the Vulgate, penance. Mediator. Priest. Now here's a really big one. Because you don't find that, you see, in the New Testament with reference to New Testament ministers. You find things like presbyteros, the presbyters, episkopos, the episcopal or the bishop. You find things like that, but you don't find priest as a minister. But you find that in the Vulgate, and so that has become, the popular term designating the local Roman Catholic leader. He's not a pastor or a bishop, not the local leader. He's a priest. Sacrament. We reluctantly use that term, I think, in Protestantism, sacrament. It's not really a very good term, because you hear in that sacrifice, and then you hear in that Mass. Communion. Communion. Baptism. That really comes, from Greek. But remember, sometimes I said the Vulgate just makes a Greek term more popular. Synagogue. Evangelism and apostle. Remember, I'm not saying that all these are Latin words here, that we don't have anything in the Greek, like if we would give ourselves euangelion. You know what's that big E-U-A-G-G-E-L-I-O-N? You know what that word means? What does that look like? It means gospel. In Greek, it's the word for gospel, which we get evangelism from. And so it's really not a Latin term, it's a Greek term, but yet the Latin Bible is what made that term so popular. Euangelion. We get evangelism from that. It just means gospel. Every time you find gospel, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, this is a euangelion of Jesus Christ. Apostle is the same thing, this is really a Greek term. A-P-O-S-T-O-L-O-S, apostolos. Obviously you can see apostle in that. A-P-O-S-T-O-L-O-S, apostolos. So some are Greek terms, but they were used so heavily in Jerome's Vulgate that they were brought into greater measure of popularity in Christian circles, the churches, and in theological discussions. And hence they pass down to us and just become, we talk of the apostles, and really we're speaking Greek whenever you say apostle. Every time you say apostle, you're speaking Greek, apostolos. Or euangelion, every time you say evangelism, or evangelization, or evangelicalism. It's just all different forms of this word that means the gospel. Baptizo, and you have other words that are nothing but Greek terms here. Okay, so there's one way I'm saying that Jerome's Bible is still with us today. We use those terms around here all the time. You use them in your own little prayer life or study life or witnessing life all the time. Predestination, justification, sanctification. And the odds are you wouldn't be using those terms if Jerome never would have written his Bible. We'd be using some other term, some other term that we don't now know because it was never invented to fit these words in the Greek Bible. So it is enduring. Jerome's Bible has endured. Now, the Catholic scholars have always looked to the Vulgate in their translations. Even though some of the newer and better ones are based only on Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, they still have looked to the Vulgate whenever they're doing their translating work. In the past, I think I'll show you this later on this morning, maybe a little dishonesty has often been involved in the process of Roman Catholic translation in some settings and on some occasions. Because they held to the text of the Vulgate, even when it was in opposition to Hebrew and Greek. So what I want to do now is show you how some of the popular recent Roman Catholic English Bibles have been influenced by the Vulgate. Particularly, we'll look at, first of all, the order of books as they're found. And I guess the three important Roman Catholic Bibles of modern times would be R.A. Knox's Bible, then the Jerusalem Bible, and then the New American Bible. The Reims Douay, the Confraternity Bibles, they go back sometime earlier. Reims Douay goes back several centuries. And we'll look at that later because it's an English Bible, so we'll look at that under English translations, as well as Knox's, Jerusalem, and the NAB. But these are the three recent Catholic Bibles. I think Knox did his back in the 1940s, and then Jerusalem and NAB have been done since that time. But let's look at how the Bible, the Old Testament books, especially the Old Testament books, have been ordered. Some of the Clementine manuscripts, you remember Sixto Clementine? Some of the Clementine manuscripts have the Catholic epistles immediately following Acts. That's a little unique. We certainly don't have that today. Catholic Bibles don't have that today. You've got Pauline epistles follow Acts, and then Catholic epistles follow Pauline. But some of the Clementine manuscripts have the Catholic epistles immediately following Acts. Others, still of the Clementine family, have Laodiceans in the New Testament. And we don't have that, and Catholic Bibles don't have that today. But some of the Clementine manuscripts have Laodiceans in the New Testament. But most of the diversity occurs in the Old. Now here's the sequence. Here's the sequence of Old Testament books in the Vulgate. In the Vulgate as we have it now. First of all, the canonical books are in the same order as in our Bible. You say, well, what's going to make it different then? Well, what's going to make it different? The Apocrypha. The canonical books are in the same order. Genesis begins at Malachi, ends at the canonical books. What's going to make it different as far as their books and the length of it and page numbers and everything else will be the inclusion of certain of these apocryphal works, right? And remember, this wasn't the work of Jerome originally. He hurriedly did a brief copy of Tobit and Judith, I believe, because he was prevailed upon by two bishop friends of his. But he didn't translate the Apocrypha because he said the Apocrypha can't be found in Hebrew manuscripts. And one of the criteria for acceptability in the Old Testament was it had to be extant, the manuscript, it had to be extant in the language of the Bible, which for the Old Testament would have been Hebrew and not Greek. And remember, he's the one who got everyone to go back Well, he tried to get everyone. Not everyone followed, but he went back to Hebrew for the Old Testament, not for Greek, feeling that, and he was correct in thinking so, it would be more reliable following that fashion. But over the centuries, you see the Vulgate manuscripts were used to stick some of those apocryphal books in them. So here was the order: Tobit and Judith. This is in the Vulgate as we have it now. Tobit and Judith are found between Nehemiah and Esther. But remember, Nehemiah was referred to as second Esdras in the Latin Bible. Ezra was first Esdras, Nehemiah was second Esdras, and then you have an apocryphal third and fourth Esdras. So Tobit and Judith, in that order, found between Nehemiah, which is the same as second Esdras, and Esther. Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, or ben Sirach. So wisdom and Ecclesiasticus found between the Song and Isaiah. Song of Solomon and Isaiah. Baruch after the last chapter of Lamentations. 1st and 2nd Maccabees after Malachi. Daniel's 3 editions are appropriately placed in his book. Do you remember what those 3 editions in 3 places are? What are the 3 editions? Bell and Dragon, Susanna, those are chapters 13 and 14, and the Song of the Three Holy Children, the Prayer of Azariah, Song of the Three Holy Children, which is stuck in appropriately in the 3rd chapter of Daniel where it fits. And then you have the other 2 as chapters 13 and 14. The additions to Esther are attached to the end of her book. Now see, that's unlike Daniel. Daniel's 3 editions are put appropriately in the book. Well, 2 end up as chapters afterwards, but that's the appropriate place for them. Whereas Esther's material all is attached at the end, where it doesn't make any sense then when you read Esther's book and then read the additions to Esther, because the additions fit at various places within Esther's book. Then 3rd and 4th Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh are placed as an appendix to the New Testament. Okay, in Catholic Bibles today, especially Jerusalem NAB, much of that remains the same with the following exceptions. So if I don't give an exception, it means Jerusalem and or NAB would be the same as Vulgate. Maccabees are after Esther now. Her additions are in the book instead of an appendix to Esther's book. So Maccabees after Esther instead of after Malachi. Her additions in the book itself instead of after her book. And 3rd and 4th Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh are not even accepted. Of course they're not. Those are the 3 that the Catholics don't accept. But it's interesting, they've always been in the Vulgate, though. And they've been in the Vulgate, 3rd and 4th Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh, as an appendix to the New Testament. I'm just trying to show you the historical discontinuity of all of this, the incongruities of always saying the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate is our Bible, and then really not following the Latin Vulgate or the author of that Vulgate, Jerome, who said don't accept the Apocrypha. Which is very interesting. We were studying that in class this week, and I brought that point up in class. We were studying Canonicity, and I said, isn't it interesting that the Catholics who always say the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, like the Old Testament people in Jeremiah's day were always saying the temple, the temple, the temple. They're always saying the Vulgate, and yet what did the author of the Vulgate tell his people? Only the books that are in Hebrew, only the canonical 39, 24, 22, however you want to count them, Old Testament books are to be accepted, not these apocryphal, spurious, extra, additional books. And yet they claim his work and don't claim his opinion about those books. And then they claim his work and they don't claim the whole work, because the manuscripts of the Vulgate will give us 3rd and 4th Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh as an appendix to the New Testament. And you open your Jerusalem Bible or NAB Bible, you don't have them at all. Seems like someone passed a rule against the authority of the Vulgate then, in taking those out completely. The book of Psalms is a little interesting. The Hebrew Bible, when they're counting the verses, you count the title of the psalm as the first verse. Like in Psalm 18, it has a long title there about David, Psalm 18. So you end up with an extra verse in the Hebrew Bible, because their first verse we don't even have. Their second verse is our first verse, and their third our fourth, and so forth, or our second, and so forth. A lot of this is the same in the Vulgate. The Vulgate does count the title of the psalm as the first verse of the psalm. The NAB does this even now, but the Jerusalem Bible dropped that method and went to the English method. So the NAB, the New American Bible, is going to have one additional verse in every psalm if that psalm begins with a heading. Not all the psalms have headings, remember. So the NAB is going to be different than the Jerusalem, and your NAB would be different than your NIV and then your KJV in that regard, that it's going to have an additional verse in each psalm for every psalm which begins with some type of heading or beginning. And also in the Vulgate manuscripts divided the psalms up differently. We still start with 1 and end with 150. But in two cases, 2 psalms were joined into one, and in 2 other cases, 1 psalm was split up into 2. So it counterbalanced itself and still gave us our total of 150. I don't think anyone has really wanted to get away from that number and give us 147.6700 or something, because it's a little too weird. Or even to give us 149 or 151. Even believing in David and Goliath in that psalm, you hate to add an extra one in because 150 sounds like a good number. So here's what the Vulgate did. Our Psalms 9 and 10 are coalesced as Psalm 9 in the Vulgate. So that gives them 149 Psalms then. Our Psalms 114 and 115 are joined as 113. You got to go back a number because you already lost one with 9 and 10. You following all this? Our Psalms 114 and 115 would be the Vulgate's 113, which gives it 148 Psalms now. We've lost 2, but in the next 2 points are going to gain 2, be back to 150. Our Psalm 116 is split up into 114 and 115. And our Psalm 147 is split up into 146 and 47. So for the Vulgate, only Psalms 1 through 8 and 148 through 150 would be like ours. Everything else would be a different number. And that's helpful to know if you're trying to look something up in the Vulgate and you're looking up Psalm 50, you need to know how to offset that according to this little schedule here and find the right psalm there, because everything will be different then. So only our Psalms 1 to 8 and 148 to 50 would be like the division that the Vulgate has. Okay, the NAB is just like the KJV in its classification of 150. The Jerusalem Bible, however, unites Psalms 9 and 10 as one psalm. But it keeps both of the numbers in the psalm because it knows it has to end up with 150. If you open your Bible to Psalms 9 and 10, probably they were at one time an original psalm, or if not that, they have a very, very close relationship. Psalm 9 and Psalm 10. And they're oftentimes studied together. It's an acrostic. It's an acrostic psalm. The way that it's set up when you combine it with 10. That last verse in chapter 9, Selah. Whenever a verse ends like that, we don't really know, and there's lots of guesses as we've studied in Old Testament introduction what that word really meant. perhaps some Paul's musical interlude or whatever. We really don't know, but you're not going to really have a psalm ending like that because it has something to do with the way you were chanting it or saying it or quoting it or the way you were playing your musical instrument, and that couldn't be the end because you got to go on and finish whatever it was that you had begun. So that's one good clue that these psalms should really be together. And we really don't have time, like I'd like to read them, but if you sit down maybe sometime and read those two psalms together, I think you'll see that they're just very, very close in exactly what they're expressing here. And just in reading them, and you notice Psalm 10 doesn't have a heading, Psalm 9 does. Psalm 10 had a heading, that would just knock this theory into Kingdom Come then. But when it doesn't have a heading, it could well have been part of 9, where it was all one together. So anyway, the Jerusalem Bible unites these two psalms, but it keeps the numbers in there. You can see, if you've got a Jerusalem Bible, how they're united, but how that 10th number is still maintained in order to keep our total number of 150. Okay, one final thing we want to look at, and you'll need your Bible, you'll need your King James Bible to look at a couple of examples. A couple of examples of others that we could give, but two of perhaps the best ones, of just how the Vulgate has influenced Bible translations. We're talking about how Jerome's Bible has endured, it's lasted, it's prevailed in one sense, the keeping of certain theological terms, and in just the translation which has been given in some verses. So we want to look at an example. Both of these are in the Johannine material, one in John chapter 10, and the other in 1 John chapter 5. How Jerome's Vulgate has influenced Bible translations and what the current Catholic translations, R.A. Knox, Jerusalem, NAB, some or all or one of those, what they have to say about these disputed passages. Let's begin over in 1 John 5. That's better known to you, and I think the John 10 one will prove to be a little more interesting to you because you could even get a little sermon and go off on riding a hobby horse preaching from John 10 on this interesting mistranslation that we have in the King James Version. 1 John 5, verse 7, B and 8a, the so-called Heavenly Witness edition. This was actually not in the Vulgate. So the Vulgate hasn't influenced us in giving it to us, but I wanted to bring this in because of what the Catholic Bibles have had to say and do with this so-called Heavenly Witness passage. 1 John 5, 7b, in heaven the Father, the Word, the Holy Ghost, and these three are one, and 8a, and there are three that bear witness in earth. That little phrase beginning with in heaven in verse 7 and ending with in earth in the beginning of verse 8. The first allusions to it may come as early as a Spanish writer in 385 A.D. And I trust that you'll maybe remember perhaps part of the story with Erasmus as to how it ended up in the Bible. Do you remember Erasmus was trying to give us the first official printed Greek New Testament? And he was trying to beat Jimenez, see which one would be the first one. And Jimenez got his done first, but Erasmus published his first because the Pope put a clamp on the work of Jimenez. And so a friend of Erasmus came to him and wanted to know why in his first edition he didn't include this Heavenly Witness passage, and Erasmus in effect said, well, because it's not in the Greek manuscripts. And then he made a foolish dare. And he said, if you can show this to me in a Greek manuscript, I'll put it in my next edition. And from all evidences, that person to whom he was speaking went home and wrote a Greek manuscript and put that edition in there, because this was a Spanish writer in 385. We don't have it in Greek, you see. Brought it back to Erasmus, and Erasmus, knowing the whole time this was wrong, did it anyway. And I forget what edition, the fourth edition or whatever of Erasmus that was placed in. That happened to be the cheapest of the editions he put out. That happened to be the one that became popular, instead of one of his others that didn't have that in there, one of his earlier ones that didn't have that in there. It became popular because it was accessible to the people because it wasn't that expensive, and it had the heavenly witness passage in there against the good and better judgment of Erasmus, this Dutch humanist and Greek scholar himself, but he made a rash dare to this friend of his, a Catholic friend of his, by the way, and he had to fulfill that. He said, I dare you, if you can find it in another Greek manuscript and prove it to me, I'll put it in there. The fellow went home and wrote it and brought it back and proved it, and Erasmus had to eat his words, as they say. It is in the Sixto Clementine Bible. It is in the Sixto Clementine. A late 19th century encyclical by Pope Leo XIII defended it as authoritative. And so that pretty much settled the matter as far as Roman Catholics were concerned. A late 19th century encyclical by Pope Leo XIII defended it as authoritative. And so what do the Catholic translations today have to say about that? Well, the NAB is fair here. It gives the right translation, which means it doesn't include any of that passage, and then it doesn't even give a footnote saying, well, perhaps we made a mistake and perhaps here's the real thing. The NAB is very fair here. It just says there are three that bear record: the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one. Leaves out that whole, what I have in my Bible here written in a parenthetical phrase. Leaves out that entire phrase there. Not giving us any footnote, giving us the thought of the possibility of including that phrase, which is fair. The Jerusalem Bible has a little footnote, an interesting one, and I'll read that note to you. You don't need to get it down, but you can listen to what it says and sum it up in your own words. The words are not in any of the early Greek manuscripts. That's true. Not in any of the early Greek manuscripts, or any of the early translations. Perhaps that's true. This Spanish writer in 385 is really not giving us a translation. He's commenting on that, which means it goes back there somewhere early, if that's even a true reference, and that's not provable, I don't think. Or in the best manuscripts of the Vulgate itself, which is true. I mean, he's ruling out the passage. Whoever's writing this footnote here in the Jerusalem Bible is ruling it out. These words are not in the early Greek manuscripts, not in the early translations, and not in the best manuscripts of the Vulgate, and are probably, and here's what's interesting, and you'd never catch this unless you'd studied this material, and are probably, these words are probably a gloss that has crept into the text. Well, there's no probable about it. It's definite that it's a gloss that has crept into the text. So they could have been a little more honest in telling us the origin of that heavenly witness passage there, but they weren't. That word probably, you see, they should have stricken that out and should have said, and this is a gloss that has crept into the text. So I fault the Jerusalem Bible's footnote on 1 John 5:7. It's really not fair. It's saying it probably came in, and there's no probability about it. It's very definite that it's a gloss that crept into the text in the beginning of the 16th century, in the time of Erasmus, 1510 to 1520, around there. All right, what about R.A. Knox? Knox just gave us a New Testament, not a whole Bible like these other two. We'll study Knox's little New Testament. It's an interesting little thing. R.A. Knox gives the heavenly witness passage in the text. See, Jerusalem Bible doesn't do that. Jerusalem puts it all down in a footnote. So the NAB is most fair here. The Jerusalem Bible is running second race here, and R.A. Knox is just dishonest, because he puts the heavenly witness passage in the text, and then in a footnote, here's what he writes. This verse does not occur in any good Greek manuscript. True. But the Latin manuscripts may have preserved the true text. Well, that's a lie. That is really a lie, and it's very misleading. It's calculating in its misleading whoever's going to read it. The Latin manuscripts may have preserved the true text, and there's no question about it. The Jerusalem Bible just had said they're not in the best manuscripts of the Vulgate itself. So it's totally misleading and borders on being an outright falsehood as far as I'm concerned. That's R.A. Knox's. But Catholic scholarship has advanced a little, you see, since R.A. Knox's time, 1940s. Okay, and in John 10, here's probably the most famous example if you want to know how the Latin Vulgate has influenced Bible translation since that time. And this is this isn't a heretical change or something in John 10 and verse 16. It certainly does change the meaning, although you could have gotten the correct meaning out of this anyway. It would just depend on your reading of the whole context here as well as your understanding of the rest of what the New Testament had to say. Okay, let's get some of the verses in context. This is probably how the Vulgate has most influenced, let's say, our King James Version. We could look at other verses where it's influenced it, but here's a very profound influence of that. Okay, verse 11, John's Gospel, the 10th chapter, the 11th verse. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. But he that is an hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth. And the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth because he is an hireling. He does it because that's his nature, and because he's hired. He doesn't own the company. He just pushes the broom, and so he doesn't have anything to lose to run. And careth not for the sheep. But I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And it's the 16th verse here. You ever read this and wondered what this meant? And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Okay, let's look at what we have here. We've got two folds, F-O-L-D, two folds. One of them just called this fold, and the other one called one fold in verse 16. The Old Latin rightly gave the Greek for the second fold. Jerome made a mistake. He was fallible like the rest of us, even though he was a brilliant man. He made a mistake with his second fold in translating the Greek. The RV has it preserved correctly, and I'm sure the NIV will have it in something along this line, where they translate fold as flock. Where they translate fold as flock. Say, well, that doesn't make any difference one way or the other which way you do it. Oh, yes, it does. You just watch, hold on here a moment, and I'll show you how it makes a very big difference. If nothing else, it clarifies the passage as far as I'm concerned. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd, is the correct translation. Okay, let's go with R.A. Knox. What does he have to say? We're saying that here's where Jerome made a mistake. The Vulgate itself made a mistake. And it's been carried right over into the King James Version. Okay, R.A. Knox, in his translation for English-speaking Roman Catholics in the mid-1940s, has one fold in the text. Here again, he's just not bold enough to just go ahead and give us what the Greek really says. He gives us one fold in the text, but his footnote reads as follows. One fold. The Greek here is more accurately rendered one flock. Our Lord evidently refers to the Gentiles who would believe in him. He says one fold, in other words, comment on one fold. The Greek here is more accurately rendered one flock. Our Lord evidently refers to the Gentiles who would believe on him. The Jerusalem Bible has it correct in the text and has one fold in the footnote. And see, that just turns me into hysterics, because the Jerusalem Bible gives us what's correct because they looked in the Greek manuscripts and gave us flock instead of fold. Well, why do you think it's necessary to give us one fold, which is nothing but a pure mistranslation, in a footnote? Except you're so hyped up about Jerome and the Latin Vulgate. You're wanting to show us what the Vulgate has here, even though it's just totally a mistranslation. Then the NAB I think has it correct, but then it has a footnote as well. And its footnote is very interesting here. It reads as follows. Jerome in the Vulgate translates one-fold. But there is no evidence in Greek or Latin to support this reading. Jerome in the Vulgate translates one-fold. But there is no evidence in Greek or Latin to support this reading. Translating the Greek word as sheep herd would bring out the wordplay involved that you don't get when you do flock and shepherd, as you'll see here in just a moment. This is a very interesting verse here. And this is a good footnote. I really enjoyed this footnote. Translating the Greek word that we've given you as flock, that Jerome said was one-fold, as sheep herd, a herd of sheep, sheep herd. Although we speak of sheep as flocks. You know, a cattle herd, but a flock of sheep. That's why sheep herd kind of sounds a little funny. But they're trying to make a point. Translating the Greek word as sheep herd would bring out the wordplay involved, as the Greek terms for flock and shepherd, those last two words here in your verse, flock and shepherd, are as much alike as sheep herd and shep herd. Are you following that?
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. It's a wordplay. It's a play on words here, is what John is after in his writing here. The Greek terms for flock and shepherd are as much alike as sheep herd, two different words, sheep herd, a herd of sheep, and shep herd, the shepherd of the sheep herd. Because what we have here are, first of all, our Greek word for sheep herd, poiné. I'll show you how similar they are. Poiné, sheep herd, poiné. Poimen, for shepherd. You see, it's a word play. You can tell without reading Greek. There's something going on here. You've got P-O-I-M N long E. And you've got down here P-O-I-M long E N. You got a word play there. You have it here in the very end of this verse. As sheep herd or flock, poiné, as shepherd, poimen. Okay, why then give it as flock and not as fold? That's just interesting as far as the Greek construction is concerned on it. But then as far as the interpretation of the verse, we'll look at it again. Other sheep I have, and I think R.A. Knox was right in his footnote, what he had to say about the interpretation of it. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Then he goes on, if we had the King James, and it says, so that there be one fold and one flock. Well, you know what a fold is. A fold is quite a bit different than a flock. A fold is like a pen that you keep the sheep in. That's what a fold is. A flock could be in the fold, but not necessarily. A flock could be out in the pasture as well. Whereas you can't have a fold out there. The fold is the enclosure where the sheep are. I think the NIV maybe even gives it as pen, something like that. Other sheep I have which are not of this pen. Them also I must bring. They shall hear my voice, and there shall be not one pen now, but one flock, and then one shepherd. You see all of the analogies drawn in here. He's picturing, these are Jewish versus Gentile sheep, in other words. And he's talking about you disciples, you apostles, you are my sheep, but you are the sheep here in this fold. And he said there are other sheep that I must bring which are not here in this fold. In other words, the Jewish Christians at that time were all bound up there in this pen. And remember, Colossians speaks about breaking down the middle wall of partition. I think it refers more to the construction, the precincts in the temple area, not to the analogy of a Jewish sheep pen or a sheepfold here, but I think the same thing is true, that that's going to be destroyed. In other words, the Jewish sheep who are Christians are going to be let out of this little pen that they're in. And they're going to be joined with another large sheep herd or flock of sheep that are Gentile sheep. And they're all going to be mixed in together, which was something that you didn't do. Every shepherd kept his various flocks of sheep totally separate. And they knew their shepherd by the voice of the shepherd. And he could many times actually call his sheep out by name, because he wasn't like big ranchers today where you have thousands and thousands of animals. You just have a little small group of 15 or 20 following you around. You can easily have all of them named. So I think it's a contrast. He's showing a contrast here between the Jewish Christians, which are going to begin the church, and the Gentile Christians, which are that other group of sheep that are not in this pen, not in this fold, that I'm going to have to bring. They're going to know me and I them, and they're going to hear my voice, and I'm going to call them by name, and so that we're going to eventually have one large flock together, no longer in a pen, because we're going to get outside of this pen, being penned up business. We're going to have one large flock out in pasture, if you will, together, and one shepherd over them. So there is something that's been perpetrated in the King James Bible by means of Jerome's Vulgate. That really changes the meaning, because we're all locked up together then. We'd have other sheep I have not of this pen. I'm going to bring them here so that we can all be in the same pen together. And I'm sure there'd be some hair or wool flying one or the other. You get them all together in one pen. But these are going to be sheep that are one flock, not one fold, because fold has to do with being penned up.